If the Alpha King had ever troubled to look at the people who filled his cup, he might have learned, years sooner, that the most dangerous face in his realm was carrying a tray through a roadside inn. But kings do not look at the help. So, when it all came down around his ears, the truth, if we are honest, was that the fault was his own. The inn was called the Hollow Kettle, and on any ordinary night it served drovers and wool traders and men too tired to ride the last league home in the dark. This was not an ordinary night. On this night it held 3 crowns beneath one low and smoke-stained roof, and the girl who carried the ale between them was the only soul in the room that nobody thought to name. Her name was Sella. She had poured at the hollow kettle since she was small enough to need both hands for a single jug, and in all the years between, she had mastered the one skill the trade truly paid for, which was the skill of being looked past. A good server, old Bevan the innkeeper liked to say, is a useful bit of furniture that happens to fetch things. Selah had made herself into the finest, quietest furniture on the whole of the northern road. She had to be quiet tonight, of all nights. The inn sat astride the old border stone, on ground that belonged to no lord and every lord, and that was why they had chosen it. 3 powers who could not stand to be in one another's kingdoms had agreed to be in one another's presence here, for one night, to see whether the long and bleeding quarrel of the border could be talked into something. At the head of the long table sat the reason the other 2 had come at all. The Alpha King of Craghold Darien was not a large man in the way that men who fear being small make themselves large. He did not need to be. He sat easy in his chair, with one boot crossed over his knee, and the whole room bent toward him, like grass under a wind. He was not bothering to raise. Selah had heard the songs about him, the young king who had held a fracturing realm together with nothing but nerve and a low voice. She had assumed, as one does, that the songs were paid for. Watching him now, she was less sure. She kept her eyes down and her feet moving. That was the work. Fill the cup before the cup is empty, so that no great man ever has to notice he was thirsty. She filled for the king's captains. She filled for the sour-faced envoys from the eastern hold. And she was reaching to fill for the guests from Marrowhold, the hard men from the west whose lord had lost 2 brothers to Craghold Steel. When one of the western men put out a boot and hooked her ankle as she passed, she went down hard. The tray did not. 20 years of carrying trays had taught her hands a loyalty her feet could not match, and she landed on one knee with the jug held high and clear, and not a drop of it spilled, which somehow made the laughter worse. "Careful, girl," said the man who had tripped her, grinning into his cup. "You will spoil the good wine, and then what will you be worth less than you are now, and that is a hard thing to picture." The table of Western men laughed. A serving girl on her knees is the oldest joke in the world, and it never stops being funny to the sort of men who tell it. Selah did not answer. Answering was not the work. She rose, and she set the jug down with 2 steady hands, and she let the heat climb up the back of her neck where no one could see it, and cool there unspent. She had been mocked in this room, by better men than these, and by worse. It cost nothing, she told herself. It cost nothing to be furniture. Furniture does not bleed. What she did not do, because she had trained herself out of it, was look up at the head of the table. If she had, she might have seen that one man in the whole crowded room was not laughing. The Alpha King had gone very still in his easy chair, and he was watching the Western men laugh at the serving girl with an expression that had nothing easy in it at all, as though he were filing the faces of everyone who found it funny. But she did not look up, and so she missed it. She gathered the empty jugs and turned to go back for more. And it was in the turning that the night stopped being ordinary and became the night that everything after would be measured from. Because the lord of the Marrowhold men, a broad and gray-bearded warrior named Sarn, who had said almost nothing all evening, chose that moment to actually look at her. Not the way the others had looked, which was not looking at all. He looked at her face the way a man looks at a word he cannot quite read, And then the way a man looks at a word he suddenly can, and the color went out of his own face as though a plug had been pulled somewhere beneath his heart. His cup slipped from his fingers and struck the boards and rolled, spilling dark wine across the floor in a long, slow tongue, and nobody at that table laughed at the spill, because they were all looking at Lord Sarn, and Lord Sarn was looking at the serving girl, as though the dead had walked in wearing an apron. "It is not possible," he said. His voice came out wrong, thin and cracked in a big man's chest. "You drowned, gods keep us. You were a child and you drowned. We buried an empty box. I carried the corner of it myself." Sella stood in the middle of the room with an empty jug in each hand, and no idea on this earth what the man was talking about. And every crown in the hollow kettle turned, slow as a tide, to look at the girl nobody had troubled to name. For a moment, that stretched far too long. No one in the inn said anything at all. Selah's first thought, the thin animal thought, underneath all the others, was that she should keep moving, fill the cup before the cup is empty. But there was no cup now, only the long stare of the whole room, and the Western Lord White, and shaking on his feet, and the wine still spreading at his boots. "My lord," she said carefully, "the way you speak to a man who has had far too much. I have never drowned. I would remember. Let me bring you water. Do not." Lord Sarn came around the end of the table, and two of his own men rose to check him, and then did not dare because there was something in his face past reason. He stopped an arm's length from her and looked, and his eyes were wet. That mouth. That is her mouth. The line of the brow. "I sat in the great hall of Violin when I was young, and I watched Queen Ondine come down the water stair in the winter light. And I tell you before every god that ever drew breath, I am looking at her. Now you have her face. You have the drowned queen's face, down to the last hair of it." Sella had heard the name Valen the way one hears the names in old songs. A place that had been and was not. A kingdom the sea had taken along with its whole royal line in a single black winter a little more than 20 years gone. She had heard it, the way she had heard about giants. It had nothing to do with a girl who poured ale on the northern road. "You have me confused with a painting, my lord," she said. And she meant it to be gentle, and it came out steady and clear and carried to every corner of the silent room. "I am Sella. I am nobody. Ask anyone here. They will all tell you the same. I am the girl who fetches things." And that, as it happened, was the exact wrong thing to say, because it was the king who answered her. "No," said Darien of Craghold, and he had risen from his chair. Though she had not heard him move, he was looking at her now the way Sarn was looking at her. But colder, faster, a man doing sums behind his eyes and not liking the total. "No. If Sarn of Marrowhold says that face belongs to the house of Valen, then that face belongs to the house of Valen. He has no reason to lie and every reason on the earth to wish it were not true. Which means, girl, that you are not nobody. You may be the single most dangerous nobody left alive." She should have been frightened. Instead, the thing that rose in her was the old banked anger of a lifetime of being furniture suddenly finding a door. "Then everyone in this room has finally agreed on something," Selah said. "For 20 years I have been nobody, and it was very convenient for all of you. Now one frightened lord looks at my face, and I am a dangerous somebody, and that is convenient for you too, is it not, your grace? Because a dangerous somebody is a thing a king can use." She set the 2 empty jugs down on the table, one and then the other, with a click like a door closing. "I am not a thing to be used. I pour ale. I have never asked a crown for anything, and I am not going to start by letting one decide what I am. Find your banner somewhere else." It was an unforgivable thing to say to a king in front of his rivals, the sort of thing a wiser woman would have swallowed whole. But Sella had never before that night been close enough to a king to learn to fear one, and so she said it. And having said it, she could not unsay it, and the whole shape of the night bent around those words, and would not bend back. Darien looked at her. For one strange breath, she had the sense that under the sums and the cold, he was, of all the impossible things, on the edge of a smile. Then the Western man moved. She understood it too late. The way you understand a stare that is not there. Lord Sarn's men had not come to Marigold's rescue when he faltered. But a face worth a war is a face worth taking, and two of them came off the bench, fast and low, and reaching for her. And the inn erupted. Someone knocked the lamp. The king said one word she did not catch, and Craghold's steel came out all along the table, and a hand closed hard on Sela's arm, and she was hauled backward through the sudden dark and the shouting, past the spreading fire of the spilled lamp, out a door and into the cold. With no earthly idea whether the hand that held her had taken her to save her or to keep her. She spent that night in a stone room, she did not know, behind a door she was not permitted to open, in the king's seat of Craghold, and no one would tell her whether she was a guest or a prisoner, which is its own answer of a kind. That, by the grey of the next morning, the worst of the shaking had passed, and left her hollow. She sat on the edge of a bed far softer than any she had slept in, and tried to make the pieces of the night fit together, and they would not, the way the pieces of a bad dream never quite do. A drowned queen, a drowned kingdom. Her own plain face on the water stair of a hall she had never seen. The bolt drew back, and she was on her feet before the door opened, and then she nearly wept because it was Win. "Do not look at me like that. I talked my way in with a stack of linens and a great deal of lying," Win said, and dropped the linens and hugged her hard. Win had poured at the hollow kettle alongside her for 6 years. A round and freckled girl with a mouth that never rested, and she was the single, most welcome sight Sela had ever been given. Half the West Road thinks you are a ghost, and the other half thinks you are a princess, and I told them you are neither. You are Sela, and you cannot even keep a cat, but nobody is listening to me, Win. Sela held her friend by both arms. "Tell me what they are saying, all of it. Tell me true, because no one here will." So Win told her, sitting close on the too soft bed, in the low voice of someone who knows the walls have ears, that Lord Sarn had wept in the yard and sworn the drowned heir of Vaelin was alive. That everyone understood what a living heir of a broken kingdom was worth, which was an army. If the right hand raised her up and said, "Here is your rightful queen, follow her against the man who let your country fall," that 4 powers would go to war tonight to have her, and one of them was the man whose roof she was under. "They are not fighting over you, because they love you," Win said, and her freckled face was frightened, in a way Sela had never once seen it. "They are fighting over you because of what your face lets them do. Sela, whatever you are, you have to be careful now in a way you have never had to be careful about anything." Before Sela could answer, the bolt drew back a second time, and a man came in without knocking, which told her before anything else did that he had the right to. He was old, straight-backed, silver at the temple, with the weathered calm of a soldier who had outlived most of his war. He wore the grey and iron of Craghold, and Win scrambled up and dropped a clumsy curtsy, but the old man's eyes were only for Sela, and there was something in them she could not name, something that looked almost like grief, or almost like guilt, gone as fast as it came. "Girl," he said, and his voice was kind, which somehow frightened her more than any of the shouting had. "My name is Reynard. I am the king's marshal, and I have served this house longer than that boy on the throne has been alive. I am for what little it is worth to you this morning, the nearest thing to a friend you have inside these walls." He looked at her a moment longer, and the strange grief crossed his face again. "You have grown into your face, at that. I did wonder if you would." Sela went cold. "You speak as though you have seen my face before." Something flickered behind the old man's calm, and he did not answer the question, which was an answer. Instead, he moved to the window and looked down into the yard, where even now the noise of horses and armed men came up through the glass. There is very little time, and much you do not understand, and I mean to be the one who helps you understand it before someone crueler does. But not now. Now you must make yourself ready. He turned from the window. The king is coming up to see you himself. He is on the stair already. And under his last word, Selah heard it, the same thing the marshal had heard, coming up through the stone floor into the soles of her feet, footsteps, on the stair. Unhurried, certain, climbing toward the one door in all of Craghold that she was not allowed to open, and would not have to, because it was about to open for her. The king did not knock. The door simply opened, and the man the songs were written about came into the little stone room. And for the second time Selah felt the air change, around a true alpha, that pull beneath the skin, that her own blood answered, before her mind gave it leave. Renard bowed and withdrew without being told, and Wynne pressed herself back against the wall with her eyes very wide, and then it was only the two of them, the drowned queen's face, and the king who meant to do something with it. "Sit," Darian said. "I have been sitting all night," said Selah, and did not. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. He crossed to the window instead and looked down into his own yard, full of armed men, and spoke to the glass. "By now a rider is most of the way to Marrowhold. By tomorrow every hold on this border will know that a daughter of Violin has been pouring ale on the northern road. You understand what that makes you." "A story," Selah said. "An old one that men can tell, to get what they already wanted. A war," the king said. "You are a war, Selah, not a story. A living heir of a drowned crown is the one thing that can weld 4 quarreling holds into a single army. They will come for you, and the kind version is the one where they take you breathing." She had known it since Wynne said it, but hearing it in his low, even voice made it real in a way that turned her stomach over, and the unkind version. "A dead heir starts no wars," Darian said simply, "and let that sit in the room with them." "So this is the part where you give me your solution," Selah said. "You have one. Men like you always have one, and it is always the version that costs you the least. You are not wrong." He turned from the window. "Here it is, tonight, before the rivals ride out. I name you. Not a prisoner, not a ghost. My betrothed, under the protection of the crown of Craghold, a face promised to the Alpha King, is a face no lord on this border can take without making war on me, which not one of them is ready to do this year." The room went very quiet. "No," Selah said. "I did not ask. I heard that you did not ask. That was rather my objection." She was on her feet without having decided to be. "I told you last night that I would not be your banner, and you have found a way to make me exactly that. Only now I am to smile while you plant me in the ground. You do not want a wife. You want to keep the drowned queen's face in a box that only you hold the key to." The men at the inn were at least honest that they meant to use me. For a moment he did not answer, and she thought perhaps it had struck home. Then he said quietly, "Yes, only that. And also, I would rather you did not die. Both of those things are true at the same time. You are going to have to learn to live in the narrow space where two true things sit badly together, because it is the only space you have left. And if I refuse, if I walk down into that yard and tell your rivals, myself, that I am nobody, and they may all go home, then you will be dead, or across a saddle by morning, and I will have my war anyway, only without the single card that might have stopped it." He said it without heat, which was worse than heat. "The announcement goes out tonight." "I am sorry that it does. It is already done. You may hate me for it as much as you please, and keep the whole of the hate and spend it on me later, but it is done. There it was. No taking it back." She stood in the middle of the soft, warm room that was also a very fine cage, and understood that a king had decided again what she would be, and that this time there was no jug to set down and no door to walk out through. He left her with that. It was Reynard who came back near dark, with a tray she did not touch, and a warning she could not stop turning over afterward. "He is not wrong to claim you, whatever it felt like," the old marshal said, low at the door. A promised heir is a protected heir, but hear an old man out, girl. A protected heir is still a living one, and there are those inside these walls, not at the gate, inside, who have slept easier for 20 years believing that Valen died down to its last child. To such men, you are not a banner at all. You are a grave that has come open. He looked at her with that same buried grief. Eat nothing but what comes from my hand. For now, I will explain what I can when I am able to. And he was gone before she could ask the question that mattered, which was how a loyal old marshal of Craghold had come to know so exactly how the enemies of Valen thought. They did not let her leave, but after 3 days, they stopped barring the door, which Sella supposed was Craghold's notion of trust. She had never been able to sit still in a cage. So she did the only thing that a lifetime at the Hollow Kettle had taught her to do in a room full of people who outranked her, which was to watch, and to count, and to see. And Craghold, once she began to look at it the way she looked at a crowded taproom on a fair night, was leaking from every seam. The king found her on the 4th morning at the top of the kitchen stair, doing sums under her breath. My guards tell me, you have walked the whole of the lower keep twice, he said. They cannot decide whether you are planning an escape or a robbery. Neither. I am counting your bread. She did not turn around. You bake for 400 mouths, and you buy grain for 600. Someone is carrying the difference out the Sally Gate before dawn in a gray cart, 3 mornings in 7. Your cellar rolls say, the wine runs short, because the casks weep. Casks do not weep good vintage into one particular man's private store. And the lord you seated nearest your right hand at the parley, the one who laughed the loudest at the drowned girl, has borrowed twice against his lands this year from a house in Marrowhold. A man who owes his money to your enemy is not your friend, whatever he chooses to laugh at. She turned then, and found the Alpha King looking at her with an expression she had not once been given in all her years of being furniture. He was looking at her as though she had said something worth hearing. How long have you been inside my keep? He said slowly. 4 days. I have kept stewards in this house for 4 years, who could not tell me what you have just told me. In 4 days, your stewards are not the ones carrying your cups, Sella said. The people who carry the cups see everything. We are simply never asked. Because who thinks to ask the furniture? It came out with more edge than she had meant, and she braced for the cold to come down on her. It did not. The king was quiet a moment, and then he did a thing that no one of his rank had ever done to her in her life. He asked, "Then I am asking," Darian said. "Walk my house. All of it. Every door, with my seal on it, so that no man alive can bar you from a room. Find me the rest of what my stewards cannot see, and bring it to me, and to no other soul, will you?" It was not the cage relenting. It was something stranger and far more dangerous, which was a powerful man putting a true thing into her hands. Sella had spent her whole life being looked past. She discovered, on that cold stare, that, being truly looked at, went through her like the first swallow of something strong. "I will," she said, before she could name for herself all the reasons that she should not. So she walked his house with his seal at her belt, and she was good at it, better than good. And by the end of the week she had drawn a dozen small rotten threads out of Craghold and laid them on the king's table, and he had listened to every last one. But there was a single thread she did not lay on the table, because it frightened her and because she could not make sense of it. The grey cart, the weeping casks, the borrowing lord, all of the little thefts ran downhill, out of different corners of the keep, and every one of them, when she followed it far enough, went cold at the same door. The marshal's counting room. Kind old Reynard's own domain, where the books were kept in a hand too neat to read anything into, and where twice now she had come to ask a plain question and found the clerk gone suddenly too busy to answer it. She told herself it meant nothing. Old men keep tidy books, but she had learned long ago that when 3 separate trails all die against the same wall, the thing you are hunting is on the far side of that wall." And somewhere in the quiet of the keep, someone had begun to notice that the drowned girl was no longer being looked past, she was looking back. The blow came, when it finally came, in the middle of the great hall at supper, in front of 60 people, which Sela would understand only afterward, was the entire point of it. The king had taken to seating her at his own table now, another stone laid in the wall of the story he was building, the promised bride at the crown's right hand. She hated it, and did not wholly hate it, which was its own difficulty. That night there was music, and a roasted swan, and a steward, she did not know, pouring the king's wine from a fresh jug with his eyes cast down in the proper way. It was the eyes down that saved Darian, because Sela had spent her whole life pouring wine with her own eyes down, and she knew to the inch how a server holds himself, and this man held himself wrong. He stood like someone who did not wish to be remembered, and his hand, as he poured, did not tip the jug that last careful inch to save the good wine at the bottom, the way a true servant's hand always does, because a true servant has been shouted at for wasting the good wine since he was a boy. This one did not care about the wine at all. He cared only about the cup. She moved before she had finished the thought. "Wrong cup," Sela said brightly, and reached clear across the king and lifted the wine out of his hand as it touched his lips, the way a bold bride might tease her lord in front of his court. And she set it well out of his reach and laughed as though the whole thing were a game between them. And under the table she gripped his knee once, hard enough to leave a mark, the oldest silent signal a servant owns. Stop. Danger. Now. Darian did not drink. He set the cup down. He did not so much as alter his expression. He looked once, and only once, at the steward with the lowered eyes, and 2 of his guards took the man quietly by the arms, so quietly that the music never even faltered. The wine, when they tested it well away from the hall an hour later, proved deadly enough to leave no doubt at all about what it had been meant to do. What stayed with Sela afterward was not the wine at all, it was the king. Because Darian of Craghold, a man who had come one swallow from a poisoner's aim at his own supper, was not shaken. He was not even surprised. He sat through the rest of the meal and let the music play on, and smiled at his frightened court as though nothing at all had happened, and it was only much later, when he came to her door, that he said a word about any of it. "You have good eyes," he said. "You are not surprised," said Sela. "It was neither a thank you nor a question. Someone just tried to poison you at your own table, and you sat there and finished your swan. You knew? You have been waiting for it." For a long moment the king looked at her, and something moved behind his easy face, some weighing of how much of the truth she had earned. "I knew that someone would try," he said at last. "I did not know when, or by which hand. Now I know a little more than I did last night, and I have you to thank for that." He paused. "It was not a rival's man, Sela. That steward has drawn honest Craghold wages for 11 years. Whatever is hunting us, and it is us. Now, your face has seen to that. It is not waiting out at the gate. It is already inside these walls. It has been for a very long time." He left her with that, and Sela sat a long while in the dark, and did 2 things she had not let herself do. Since the night at the inn, she thought about the counting room, where every trail went cold, and she began, very carefully, to keep score. Before we go on, let us pause for just a breath. If Sela's story has its hooks in you, and you would rather not miss the ones that come after it, take a moment now and subscribe to the channel. Then come back, because Craghold is only getting started. The days after the poisoned cup did a strange thing to the space between the king and the drowned girl. They were no longer quite captor and captive. They had become, without either of them ever saying the word aloud, 2 people hunting the same shadow through the same cold house. He began to leave doors open that had been shut to her. Not the counting room, never yet the counting room, but the small rooms where a king keeps the truth he does not say in council, the maps with the honest borders drawn on them, the letters from lords who smiled to his face and wrote poison behind their hands. He would sit across a low table from her late into the night, and they would lay out what they each had seen that day, and slowly, the thing between them stopped being a performance for the court and started, dangerously, to be a habit. She learned that the songs had lied about him in the ordinary direction, which was to make him grander and simpler than he was. He had come to the throne at 19, over the body of a father who had held the realm together by fear, and he had spent every year since learning to hold it by something harder to name, and trusting no living soul while he did. He told her this in the flat voice of a man reading a debt out of a ledger, and she understood that he was telling her only because he had at last run out of anyone else he could tell. "You keep waiting for me to be cruel," he said to her one night, not looking up from the map. "I can hear you doing it, across the table, you brace. And then I am only tired, instead of cruel, and it confuses you. And you go quiet and start counting the exits." "It does confuse me," Sella admitted. "I have known a great many powerful men from the wrong side of a tray. Cruel, I understand. Cruel, I can pour around all night and never spill a drop. You, I cannot get the measure of, and a thing I cannot measure makes me nervous, because it usually means I have not yet found the edge where it turns and cuts." "And if it does not turn," he said, "if there is no edge, then I will have wasted a great deal of very good nervousness," she said, "and I will be even more suspicious of you than I am now." That surprised a laugh out of him, low and real and gone almost before it arrived, and it changed his whole tired face for the length of it, and Selah felt the sound of it land somewhere under her ribs and stay there, like a swallowed coal. He looked up then, and the lamp was low, and the map lay forgotten between them, and for one unguarded moment neither of them was performing anything at all. He was simply a man who had been alone at the top of a freezing house for 6 years, and she was simply the one person in it who had looked at him and seen a man instead of a throne, and the small distance across the little table was suddenly no distance whatsoever. Sella stood up too fast and knocked the stool over and made some thin excuse about the lateness of the hour, and went to her room with her heart going like a hare across an open field, because she had caught herself in that moment, watching him the exact way she had once watched a crowded room for the flash of a drawn knife, only she was no longer watching him for the knife. She was watching him because she could not, any longer, quite make herself stop. That, she thought, lying awake in the dark with the coals still burning under her ribs, was far more dangerous than any poisoned cup. A cup she knew what to do with. This she did not, and worse, she was no longer certain she wanted to learn. The rivals came back for their answer on the night of the betrothal feast, and that Sella would think later was surely no accident of anyone's calendar. Crackhold put on its whole face that night. There were 100 candles and the good gold plate and lords in their winter furs from every hold along the border, and Lord Sarn of Marrowhold at the high table with his grief, worn down now into something harder and far more watchful. And there was Sella, in a gown, the deep gray-green color of open water, with the drowned queen's face painted on her by no hand but the accident of her own birth, being shown to the assembled powers of the border as the promised bride of Craghold. The dangerous claim made flesh and safely spoken for. She played it. She had spent her whole life playing parts for rooms full of men who outranked her, and she played this one all the way up to the rafters, her hand light on the king's arm, her chin level, every inch the woman that a crown had chosen for itself. And somewhere in the middle of it, between the music and the wine, she was careful not to drink, and the steady warmth of Darian at her side, the part quietly stopped being a part. He turned to say something low against her ear, some dry word meant to be seen by the watching lords more than heard by her, and she turned to meet it, and instead of a word, there was only the small, worn distance between his mouth and her own, and neither of them closed it for the court. It was not a performance. It was the realest thing she had done since the night at the inn, and it went through her like the sea coming back into an empty hall, and for one impossible breath, she felt that she knew the exact shape of what he was feeling, because it was the same shape precisely as the thing rising in her. Then the old fear came up under it and drowned it. She pulled back too sharply. "That was well done," she said, bright and cold, pitched to carry to the nearest lord. "They will believe it now." And she watched the words strike him and take some light out of his eyes, a light she herself had put there a moment before, and now deliberately put out, because it was safer to wound him than to let him see how far she had already fallen. She saw the hurt land. She told herself, firmly, that it did not matter, that a wound was cleaner than a want. It was while she was busy telling herself that, half turned away from him, that she saw the second cup. A page was carrying in the loving cup, for the betrothal toast, the great two-handled silver vessel from which the king and his chosen bride would drink together before the whole of the border, and the boy held it wrong. Tilted, just slightly, guarding one particular rim with his thumb, the way the false steward had guarded the king's cup 11 nights before. Selah did not think. Thinking was too slow. She rose from her seat, laughing, and swept the great cup out of the page's hands, as though she simply could not wait for the ceremony, as though love had made her giddy and rude, and in the sweep of it, she let the thing fall and shatter, ringing on the stone, dark wine spreading in a wide tongue across the flags, while the whole hall gasped, and then, at her helpless merry shrug and her hand pressed to her mouth, laughed and forgave the eager bride, her clumsiness. Only Darian did not laugh. He looked at the spreading wine, and then he looked at her, and she watched him understand all of it in the space of a single breath. He got her out of the hall, on the excuse of a bride's nerves before the fumes could clear, and the instant the door closed behind them, the easy face was gone, as though it had never been. "Say nothing," he told her, low and quick and hard. "Not to Sarn, not to the captain of the guard, not to Win. If it becomes known that they can reach the loving cup, in my own hall, on this of all nights, then every lord in that room learns in the same instant that Craghold cannot keep its own claim alive, and the war I have spent years and blood to hold off begins before the candles have even burned down. I need one night. Give me until dawn, and give me your silence, and I swear to you, I will put an end to this." "End it how?" Selah said. "You have been 3 steps ahead of every move on this board since the night at the inn. Where are you going now, Darion? Just once. Tell me the true thing instead of the clever one." But he was already turning, already moving away from her down the dark stone passage, and she saw with a cold lurch exactly which passage it was, because it was the one that ran down toward the marshal's counting room. And Selah stood alone in the guttering candlelight, with a promise of silence in her mouth like a coin she had never agreed to spend. And then she gathered her water-dark skirts in both fists and went after him into the dark. The counting room door stood a hand's width ajar, and lamplight leaked yellow across the flagstones of the passage. And Selah stopped just short of the spill of it, because she could hear, from inside the room, 2 voices that she knew. One was the king's, the other belonged to Reynard. She pressed her shoulder to the cold stone of the wall and did not let herself breathe, and she listened, and the ground of her whole life began, very quietly, to come apart beneath her. "You are certain it was the loving cup," the marshal was saying, in the same kind and weary voice he had used at her door on the first morning. The voice she had let herself trust because she had needed so badly to trust something. "A great pity, the girl has uncommonly sharp eyes. She always did. You would know the reach of her eyes better than any man living," said Darian. "You have watched her since she was small enough to fit in a fish basket. You put her at that inn yourself. Do not trouble to look surprised, Reynard. I have known for a fortnight, and I have suspected for a season before that." The silence that came after had a weight to it, A texture? The sound of a very old thing setting itself down at last after carrying itself upright for 20 years. So, Reynard said finally, and the kindness went out of his voice, the way warmth goes out of a room when a door is opened onto winter. You have known, and still you played the doting bridegroom. You are a colder creature than your father. Boy, and I served your father a long time. Tell me the shape of it, the king said. I have most of the pieces. I want to hear you set the last of them in place. Tell me how a marshal of Violin came to be a marshal of Craghold, with the drowned air of the first kept fresh, for 20 years, like salt fish in a cellar. And Reynard told him, because men who have carried a thing alone for 2 decades cannot always help themselves. Once, at the end, when someone finally knows enough to hear it, he told him, in the flat, proud voice of a man laying out a masterwork, how he had been Violin's own marshal, trusted with its sea gate, and how he had opened that gate one black winter to the raiders who wanted the drowned kingdom's harbors, for a price paid in gold and in promises. How, when the killing was finished and the water had closed over the royal hall, he had gone back through the wreck of everything he had betrayed, not in grief, but shopping. And how the single most valuable object left in all that ruin had been a living infant with the queen's own face, whom no one else knew had been pulled from the water, and whom a patient man might keep and hide and raise nowhere near a throne, and sell on the one far distant day when a living heir of Valen would be worth a kingdom to the right buyer. That day is today, Reynard said almost gently. The border is ripe. 4 holds that hate each other would each pay the earth for her. I only ever needed her to surface in front of witnesses, so the claim could not be called false, and then to be walked quietly out the door. You have done half my work for me, naming her before them all. I should thank you. Celis stood in the passage and felt the one warm thing she had carried her whole life crack straight down the middle and fall in 2 pieces at her feet, because she had built what little she had on a single belief, worn smooth from handling, that whatever else in her life had been cold and thankless, old Reynard had once, long ago, done a kind thing, and reached into black water and pulled a nobody child up out of it to live. She had loved him for a mercy that had never happened. He had not saved the last daughter of Valen, he had harvested her. She had been buried silver, set under the stone of the hollow kettle to wait, and every gentle word the old man had ever given her had been a hand-checking that the silver was still there. She thought helplessly of the winter. She had taken a fever at the inn and very nearly died of it. And how Reynard had appeared as though from nowhere and sat 3 whole nights at her cot spooning thin broth between her lips, and how she had carried the warmth of that memory ever after like a smooth stone in a pocket. And of one small proof that somebody in the world had once wanted her to go on breathing, he had been sitting up over his investment. He had watched 3 nights over a fevered child the way a horse trader watches over a sick colt he means to sell come spring. Every kindness, every single one of them from the very beginning, had only ever been an accountant's careful hand running down the ledger of her. She might have borne even that. She had borne a great deal. But the passage was not finished with her yet, because the king spoke again and the second knife slid in beside the first. You want to know why I let your little poisons keep failing? Darian said. Why I did not simply have you taken the moment I knew. It is because a snake that will not come out of its hole must be given something worth striking at. So I claimed her. I paraded her. I set the drowned queen's face, at my own right hand, in the full light of the hall, where you could not bear to leave it alone, and I let her believe every part of it, because a lure that knows it is a lure sits wrong on the hook. I needed you to reach for her in front of the whole board. I am not proud of it, but it worked, and I would do it again. And yet, said Reynard, and she could hear the old cruel pleasure creeping back into his voice, you do not sound proud of it either, boy. You sound like a man who has cut off his own hand to win a bout and is only now, in the quiet, beginning to feel it. Be careful of that. That is exactly how she takes you. That is precisely how her mother took better men than you will ever be. The king did not answer him. And it was the shape of that silence, more than anything that either of them had said aloud, that Sella could not bear where she stood, because she could not tell from the wrong side of a door whether it was the silence of a man who did not care at all. What? The silence of a man who cared so much more than he could afford to that he would not give his enemy the satisfaction of hearing it. Selah closed her eyes. There it was. The thing she had accused him of on the very first night, before she had let herself be talked out of believing it, by open doors, and honest maps, and a low, warm table, and one unguarded laugh. He had used her. He had set her out as bait, the claim and the girl together, and let her fall all the way into the part until she forgot it was a part. And every confession at that low table might, for all she could now tell, have been only a finer and more patient sort of leash than the one Reynard had kept her on. Both things are true at the same time, he had told her once in the same cold house. You will have to learn to live in the narrow space where two true things sit badly together. She had thought, at the time, that he was teaching her something about her own hard fortune. She understood now that he had, without meaning to, been describing exactly himself. He had used her, and he had, perhaps, come to want her, and both were true, and she could no longer separate the one from the other, and neither, she suspected, could he. She did not wait to hear which of the two men won the argument in that room. She turned, and she walked back up the passage on legs that did not feel like her own, past the guttering candles, past the music that still spilled bright and oblivious from the hall, and out through a small side door into the cold black yard, where the drowned queen's face could finally weep freely. And not one soul in all of Craghold would be there to see it, which was, after everything, still the only thing her face had ever reliably been good for. She got as far as the stables before the trap she had not known she was walking into closed softly around her, and it closed, of course, in a kind voice, because every trap in her life had. Child. Renard stepped out of the tack room, Shadow with a traveling cloak folded over one arm and a lantern lifted in the other hand, and he looked at her with such tender and practiced sorrow that even now, even knowing what she knew, some worn groove that he had spent 2 decades cutting into her heart still wanted, helplessly, to lean toward the warmth of it. I feared you might have heard more tonight than was good for you. Then you know now the true sort of man you have given yourself to. You heard him say it in his own cold words. Bait. That is all you have ever been to him, girl. A card he laid on the table to keep his enemies honest. And once the war is safely turned aside, a card that a careful king cannot possibly afford to leave in another man's reach. He held the cloak out toward her across the dark. I am the only one who has ever simply wanted you to live. Selah, come away with me tonight, out of this frozen house, to people who will raise your banner high and love you for the blood in your veins. Let the boy king keep his cold hall and his clever schemes come home, where you were always meant to be, and it was very nearly perfect. It was aimed with a marksman's care at the exact crack he had spent 2 decades widening in her. The fatherless girl's bone-deep hunger to be wanted for her own sake and not for her use. And if he had not, in his eagerness, overreached by a single word, she might in her grief have taken the cloak from his hand and gone. But he said, "Love you for the blood in your veins," and something in Sella went suddenly very cold, and very still, and very clear. It was the same clarity the taproom used to snap into just before a brawl broke, when the laughter took on a certain edge and she needed, quickly and without seeming to count the exits and mark the man whose hands had gone quiet. Because a man who truly wanted her only to live would not one single hour ago in a lamplit counting room have called her buried silver to be dug up and spent on the day her price ran highest. She had heard him say it. She had heard the pride in it. And now she held the 2 Reynards up side by side in the swaying lantern light, the one who wept over her in stable yards, and the one who had priced her over a wreck, and she found the seam where the 2 of them had been so carefully sewn together, and she saw, all at once and forever, that the weeping one was the mask and had always been the mask. And that the tenderness she had warmed herself at her whole life had been a lantern held over a pit. She had caught the oldest and best liar she knew in a lie. Not by cleverness, by having been standing, unseen as ever, in the passage when the truth was spoken aloud. The truth had a time stamped on it now, 1 hour old, and no amount of fatherly sorrow could reach back and unsay it. She almost laughed aloud, there in the dark of the stable-yard, at the pure, clean simplicity of it. 20 years he had spent teaching her that she was invisible, and he had come at last to believe his own lessons so completely that he had said the damning thing an hour ago, with her standing, not 10 feet away, as though she were a chair or a jug or a shadow on the wall. He had made her into furniture. And then he had forgotten the one thing about furniture that a cleverer man would have remembered, which is that it sits in the room the entire time and hears every word said over the top of it and forgets nothing. So she did the one thing that a lifetime on the wrong side of a tray had trained her to do better than any lord or king or marshal in that whole cold country. She gave him the part he wanted to see. "Take me to them," she said, and let her voice break, and let a single true tear fall for an entirely untrue reason. "Take me to my people, but not out the back like a thief in the night, Reynard. If I am truly the heir of Ielen, then I will not creep out of Craghold through a stable door in the dark. Let me walk out the front of it, past all of them, the way my mother would have walked. Give me that much of her, at least." The old man's eyes shone wet in the lantern light, and she saw that she had given him more than he had dared hope for, because this was precisely the thing he needed most, the heir declaring herself of her own free will before the assembled witnesses of the border, so that the claim he meant to auction could never afterward be called a forgery. "Of course," he breathed. "Of course, child. Let them all see you. Let them all finally see." He should have wondered, some cold clerkish corner of him should have wondered, why the buried silver was suddenly so very eager to be spent. But a man who has spent 2 decades counting on the certainty that no one ever truly looks at him forgets, in the end, that he too can be looked at, and read, and counted. She let him walk her back into the great hall on his arm, into the 100 candles and the furred watching lords and the long tables gone silent as she entered, into the sight of Darien, risen halfway from his chair at the high table, and gone still as carved stone, into Lord Sarn of Marrowhold, coming slowly to his feet, with his old face working. And there, in the very center of that watching room, with every rival power on the border gathered as her witnesses exactly as the marshal had wished, Selah of the Hollow Kettle turned his trap entirely inside out. "My lords," her voice, the voice of a server trained to carry over a full and roaring taproom on a fair night, went out over the hushed hall, like a bell struck once and clean. "You came to Craghold for the truth of Violaine. Here it is. And here, standing at my side with his hand so gently upon my arm, is the man who has kept that truth buried from every one of you for 20 years. She lifted the lantern out of Reynard's grip as she spoke, gently, easily, the way she had lifted 10,000 cups from 10,000 hands that never noticed the lifting, and she raised it high so that its light fell full and merciless upon his face. "This is Renard, Marshal of Craghold. But he was Marshal of Violaine first, in another winter, before he unbarred its sea gate with his own hands for a chest of raiders' gold, and let the water take a kingdom that trusted him. He walked through the drowned wreck of everything he had sold, and he found me in it, a living child with the dead queen's face, and he did not save me, my lords. He kept me. He hid me in a roadside inn like silver under a stone, and let me grow up pouring your ale, so that on the day a living heir of Violaine was worth the most, he could dig me up and sell me to the steepest bidder in this room. That day is tonight. He came here to walk me out that door on his arm, and auction my blood to whichever of you paid the highest. I know all of this, because he told it to me himself 1 hour ago. in his counting room, in his own proud voice. The oldest ledger sits behind the loose stone in the eastern flue, in a hand kept too neat to read anything into. Send men. Break the stone. He never once thought that the furniture could read. For one heartbeat, the hall did not move at all. Then it broke open into uproar, and Reynard's kind and weary face fell off all at once, like snow sliding off a steep roof, and what was underneath it was 20 years old and had no tenderness left anywhere in it. He turned on her, because a cornered liar always moves last and hardest against the one who named him aloud, and there was something bright in his hand that had come from nowhere, the same way the steward's poison had come from nowhere. But Selah had spent the whole of her life watching men's hands. She had known, from the instant his face began to change, precisely which hand the knife would be in, and precisely where his old weight would go when he threw himself forward, because she had watched 1,000 drunks throw 1,000 clumsy swings across the sticky floors of the hollow kettle. And a killing lunge is only a drunk swing with the laughter taken out. She was already not where he reached. She stepped inside the arc of it the way she had stepped between 100 brawlers, to save the good crockery, and she swept the heavy lantern up between them and turned his own weight against him, and the marshal of 2 fallen houses stumbled and came up short with guards already closing on his arms, undone. In front of the very lords he had schemed to sell her to, stopped cold by a girl he had spent 20 patient years teaching the whole world not to see. For a long moment no one in the hall moved at all. The whole gathered, might of the border, frozen between one breath and the next, staring down at the thing on the floor, that had been, not 1 hour before, the most trusted old man in all of Craghold. Then, Lord Sarn of Marrowhold made a low sound in his chest, like a roof beam, giving way under snow, and took one heavy step forward, with murder plain on his old face. And Selah understood in a flash that if she did not speak quickly, he would strike the marshal down where he stood and rob the whole border of the reckoning it had waited 20 years to hold. The king's guards had him fast before he could gather himself again. Selah stood over him, breathing hard, the drowned queen's face lit gold and steady by the flame in her fist. "You should have looked at me, Reynard," she said, and the whole silent hall heard it, in all those years, just once, as a person and not as coin. "If you had ever once truly looked, old man, you would have seen this coming a mile down the road." They broke the stone in the eastern flue, before the candles of the feast had guttered out, and the oldest ledger was where she had said it would be, and it named names and dates and the weight of raiders' gold in a hand far too neat to argue with. And so, the oldest crime on the whole of the border finally had a face fixed to it, and by dawn, that face was behind iron, in a cell beneath Craghold. Lord Sarn of Marrowhold, who had carried the corner of an empty child's coffin 20 years before, and grieved a girl he believed drowned, stood a long while at that cell door in the grey light. Then he came and found the living air, and he lowered his stiff old body all the way to his knees before her there in the cold passage, and wept without any shame at all. And one by one the rival powers who had ridden to Craghold to fight over her blood discovered that they had rather less appetite for a war, now that the man who had truly drowned Vialin was in irons, and the drowned girl herself had put him there, in the open, in front of every one of them, with a marshal's own lantern. The claim was safe, the border held its breath through that long night, and did not, in the end, break. Darian had won the exact thing he had bound her to himself to win, and Selah would not look at him. She was owed, now, every one of the things she had never once had in her life. Rank, a name spoken with a bow instead of a jeer, the freedom of the whole of Craghold, every door of it, with no seal needed at her belt. The king came to her and offered her all of them, and more besides, and she took the rank, because rank was useful and she had learned the price of being useless. She refused everything else. And when at last he came to her door with the one offer in his hands that was not politics, the offer that had nothing of the crown in it at all, She shut the door upon it, before he could so much as set it down between them. "You used me," she said, through the wood of it, because she could not do this to his face. "You said it yourself in the counting room. You did not know I was in the passage. And so for once, I heard the true thing and not the clever one. Fate, you put me out in the light, and you let me fall for the whole of it. The open doors, the honest maps, the tired confessions at the low table that I let get under my ribs like nothing ever has. And I cannot tell any more, Darian, I truly cannot. Which of it was you, and which of it was the hook, and I do not think that you can either, so no. Whatever this thing is that you are standing there holding, I will not take it from you. I have already been spent once by a man who called it love while he did it. I find I have no appetite at all to be spent a second time by one who cannot even bring himself to lie to me about it convincingly." He did not argue. That was the unbearable part of it. A crueler man, or simply a more foolish one, would have argued, would have protested and sworn, and given her a good clean wall of self-justification to pour herself around, the way she had poured around powerful men her whole life. Instead, he was silent on his side of the door for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and stripped of every clever thing. "You are right that I used you," he said. "You are wrong that all of it was the hook. But I cannot prove to you which was which, merely by standing here and swearing it, and I would not believe me either, standing where you stand tonight. So, I am not going to ask you to believe me. I am not going to ask you for anything at all." And then, unbelievably, he simply went away. He sent no letters, he sent no armfuls of flowers to make the barracks smell like a funeral. He laid no siege. For a whole fortnight, the King of Craghold simply left her the freedom she had demanded of him, and troubled her with precisely nothing, and Sella discovered, to her slow and rising fury, that a silence pitch that exactly was somehow far worse than any siege could have been. Because it was the very first thing the man had ever given her that held no use in it for him whatsoever. There was no lure in it. There was no leash. There was only a door he had chosen at last to leave shut because she had asked him to, and the maddening wall dissolving suspicion that this, of everything, might be the truest thing he had. And then, on the 15th day, the King of Craghold stood up and did a thing that no king in all the long cold history of that house had ever once been known to do. He gave away his greatest card in his own great hall in front of the assembled lords of the border who had lingered to see the claim of Violin settled to their satisfaction. He stood and the hall quieted for him the way it always did, and he settled the whole matter with the border in a single breath by throwing it open. "You came here," Darian said, and his voice was level and carried to every furred corner of the room, "to learn whether Craghold holds the heir of Valen. I will answer you plainly, and I will answer you only once. Craghold holds nothing. The lady is not a claim. She is not a card. She is not a banner for me to fly, nor for any lord in this room to raise. She never was, though I treated her as one, to my lasting shame, and to a cost I am only beginning to count. From this hour, she is a free woman, of no house, but the one she chooses for herself, beholden to no crown, promised to no throne, mine least of all. And if her freedom means the war that every one of you rode here wanting, then have your war, my lords, and know as you fight it that the King of Craghold gave up the surest shield he has ever held, rather than keep one living person in a locked box a single day longer for the safety of his own borders. I would sooner lose the card. I have lately found that I would sooner lose a very great many things." The hall went silent in exactly the way a crowded inn had once gone silent, a season and a lifetime ago, when a mocked serving girl told a king to his face that she was no one's banner, and the whole taproom forgot to breathe. Only this time, it was the king who stood undefended in the middle of the quiet. It was the king who had said the one thing that could never afterward be taken back, and who now stood there in the open with nothing at all left in his hands, waiting to learn what it would cost him. No one spoke. Lord Sarn looked a long while at the young king, standing empty-handed in the middle of his own great hall, and then he looked slowly around at the other lords of the border, at the naked want on one or two of their faces, and the swift cold calculation on the rest, and something in the old warrior appeared to make up its mind for good. "Then there will be no war over the lady," he said heavily, into the ringing quiet. "For I will not draw a sword to cage a woman that a better man than I has just this moment set free with his own mouth, at his own cost, in front of us all." Marrowhold rides home. And one by one, grudging and grumbling and thoroughly outmaneuvered by the single most reckless and honest act that any of them had ever once seen a crown commit, the rest of the border chose, in the end, to ride home too. Sella heard of it before he could ever have reached her, because Wynne came flying up the tower stair, 2 steps at a time, to tell her, breathless and laughing and crying at once and utterly unable to choose between them. And Sella sat very still with the news lying in her lap, and she felt the last careful wall she had built around herself come down, not with a crash. The way a seawall comes down when the ground beneath it finally shifts in the night, all at once, and quietly, and entirely past any mending. She found him that same night, and she did not find him on his throne. He had ridden out from Craghold alone, without escort, and he had gone back to where the whole of it had first begun, because old Bevan the innkeeper very nearly fainted dead away at the sight of the Alpha King of Craghold standing in the low doorway of the hollow kettle asking, of all the things a king might ask for, whether a man could get a cup of the ordinary ale and a quiet corner to drink it in. That was where Sella found him, crownless, his good cloak travel-stained, and his hair wind-wrecked. Sitting at the very table where a season and a lifetime past, a frightened rival lord had dropped his cup at the sight of her face. Drinking cheap sour ale in a roadside inn, like exactly the nobody he had just, in front of the entire border, made her free to be. He turned his head as she stepped in out of the dark, and he did not reach for the easy face. He seemed, at long last, to have run all the way out of it. For a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Old Bevan had fled to the far end of his own taproom and was polishing a single cup over and over with the fixed terror of a man who does not know the correct way to stand in a room with a king and has settled, in his panic, on vigorous cleaning as the safest course. The fire ticked in the grate. The same low, smoke-blackened beams she had ducked beneath 10,000 times in her life hung now over the head of the most powerful man on the whole border, as though he were nothing but another tired traveler blown in off the northern road. And Sella crossed the worn floor she had crossed all her life, carrying other men's ale, and she came and stood over the very table where the whole of it had begun, and for a long while she simply looked down at him. "You gave away your war," Sela said. "I gave away my cage," said Darian. "The war I will manage. I have managed a great deal worse than a war, and with less reason to bother." He turned the rough clay cup slowly in his 2 hands, and did not quite look at her. "I told you I could not prove to you that the low table was real, and not the hook. I have thought about it a great deal these 2 weeks. And I found there was exactly one proof I could offer you, and only one. I could put down every single reason I ever had to keep you. That was not simply that I wanted you to stay. Every reason of state, every reason of war. The claim, the shield, the border, all of it. I could set the whole of it down in front of everyone at whatever it cost me, until there was nothing left in my hands at all. And then I could come to the worst inn on the northern road, with no crown and no plan and no card left to play, and stand in front of you with empty hands and ask, at last." He looked up at her. "Stay, Sella. Not for the claim. There is no claim now, I saw to that. Only me, asking you badly, in a bad inn, as the man who should have seen you clear across a crowded room the way that fool of a lord did, and did not, because he was too busy being the cleverest man in the country to simply look at the woman pouring his wine." And Sella, who had been asked for a great many things in this very room by a great many men over the years, and had learned to pour herself smoothly around every last one of them, looked at the undefended king in the bad light of the tallow candles, and felt the whole long circle of the thing come quietly closed. "Ask me again," she said very softly, "when I have been free long enough to be certain that the yes is truly mine to give. Not tonight. Tonight you are raw all the way through, and I am not yet sure of my own 2 feet, and neither of us should be trusted with a thing this large. But Darion—" And here she let herself smile. The first whole unguarded smile the drowned queen's face had worn in longer than she could easily remember. "Ask me again, and find out what I say." It took him the better part of a year, and Sella made him spend every single day of it, not out of cruelty, but because a woman who has been a coin for the whole of her life is entitled, once, to be entirely certain that she is being chosen and not merely spent again by a warmer hand. He asked badly, and he asked often. He asked her over the honest maps at the low table, which she came back to on her own, because it turned out the habit had been real all along, and so, it seemed, had the man on the other side of it. He asked her on the cold kitchen stair where she had first stood counting his bread out loud, and caught him staring at her like a man who had heard something worth hearing. He asked her once by leaving on her windowsill, with no word at all, a single gray feather taken from the eastern flue, where the ledger had hidden, which meant nothing to anyone in the wide world but the two of them, and which made her laugh until she had to sit down on the floor. He never once, in all that year, asked her with the war or the claim or the blood in her veins, because he had learned better, and a king who learns is a far rarer creature than a king. And in the meantime, the mocked girl from the hollow kettle became, in her own slow and stubborn fashion, something that none of the songs had yet got around to. She took up the name of Violin because it was hers, and no thief had the right to keep it buried, and she refused outright the drowned throne of it, because she found she did not want a throne any more than she had ever wanted a cage. Instead, she did with a whole troubled boarder precisely what she had once done with a busy taproom. She saw it clearly, she counted it honestly. She found the small rotten things, and set them right before they could grow large enough to drown a kingdom. She caught a grain factor in Marrowhold's own pay, skimming the border levy the very way her old cellarer had once skimmed the weeping casks, and she ended a 40-year blood feud between two hill clans in a single afternoon simply by noticing that both of them were lying about the very same stretch of high pasture, and that in 40 years of killing each other over it not one soul had ever thought to ask either clan the plain and obvious question. The lords learned slowly, and much against their pride, that the drowned girl saw straight through a room the way weather sees through an open window, and that it was a very great deal cheaper to sit and take her counsel than it was to be quietly caught out by it later. The very lords who had ridden to Craghold to raise her banner over a war stayed in the end to sit at her table and take her plain counsel. Lord Sarn wept again, which he did easily now, and called her by her mother's high title, and she permitted it exactly once, and then told him kindly and finally that she answered to Sella, and always would, and that he might keep the rest for the ballads. She said yes on an ordinary morning when it came to it. No candles, no great hall, no watching lords, only bread on a plain table and the man across it, asking her the way he had asked 100 patient times before, and she found, that particular grey morning, that the wanting had at long last outlasted the fear, which is, in the end, the only way that anyone is ever truly sure of anything. The whole of the border turned out for the wedding regardless. The mock serving girl and the boy king who had thrown away a war sooner than keep her in a box. And it was a very fine wedding, and he wept all the way through the vows exactly as she had always known that he would. She did not weep quite, though it was a far nearer thing than she ever let him see. "No taking it back," he murmured to her when it was done, because he simply could not help himself. I refused you first, Darian. If you will cast your mind back, said Selah, standing there in the light with the drowned queen's face and her own hard-won smile. In front of all your rivals, in a room a great deal like this one, I told a king to his face that I was no man's banner. I have simply changed my own mind in my own time, which is the only way I was ever once going to change it at all. You did not win me. Do not you ever let the song say that you won me. She reached up and kissed him. I saw you. That is a different thing entirely, and a better one. I saw you before. A single one of them thought to bother looking. Back when you were only a tired man, being clever in a corner, and I decided, all on my own, that you would do. The best decision, said the King of Craghold, that I never once did anything to deserve. And for that, only that, Selah let him have the very last word, because it happened to be entirely true.